Number 1. Jim Jones. Jim Jones began his religious career in the 1950s as a charismatic preacher in Indianapolis, Indiana, founding the People's Temple with a message of racial equality and social justice that attracted followers from diverse backgrounds during an era of profound racial tension in America. His early ministry appeared genuinely progressive, integrating his congregation at a time when most churches remained segregated, opening soup kitchens and community programs that served the poor and marginalized, and speaking eloquently about creating a society free from racism and economic exploitation. Jones cultivated an image as a prophet with healing powers, staging theatrical faith healing sessions where members of his congregation would rise from wheelchairs or claim their cancers had vanished through his divine intervention, performances carefully orchestrated with planted audience members who would testify to miraculous recoveries that never actually occurred. His followers began to view him not merely as a pastor but as a messianic figure, someone who possessed supernatural abilities and divine insight, and Jones encouraged this perception with increasing grandiosity, eventually claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, Buddha, and Vladimir Lenin simultaneously. As his congregation grew to thousands of members, Jones moved his ministry from Indiana to California, establishing temples in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where his message of social justice and racial harmony resonated with the countercultural movements of the 1960s and early 1970s. He cultivated relationships with politicians, delivering votes and volunteers to progressive campaigns, photographed alongside elected officials who praised his community work, accepted onto civic commissions and advisory boards that gave his ministry an appearance of legitimacy and mainstream acceptance. Behind this public facade, however, Jones was constructing a totalitarian system of control over his followers that would eventually culminate in the largest mass murder-suicide in American history. Within the People's Temple, Jones demanded absolute loyalty and obedience, requiring members to call him Father and to accept his word as divine truth beyond questioning or debate. He instituted what he called catharsis sessions, public meetings where members were forced to confess sins real or imagined, subjected to physical beatings administered by church security personnel, humiliated sexually and psychologically in front of the entire congregation. All while Jones sat in judgment determining the severity of punishment for transgressions that often consisted of nothing more than perceived disloyalty or insufficient devotion. Members were required to turn over their financial assets to the church, to work without compensation in temple businesses, to live in communal housing where privacy did not exist and surveillance was constant. Jones controlled information access, forbidding members from reading newspapers or watching television that might contradict his teachings, instead subjecting them to endless recorded sermons that played through loudspeakers even while they slept, his voice a constant presence that invaded every moment of consciousness. He separated families, sending children to be raised communally while parents worked temple jobs, creating dependency relationships where members had no support system outside the church structure. Sexual abuse became systematic and widespread, with Jones claiming divine authority to have sexual relations with both male and female members regardless of their marital status, describing these encounters as spiritual experiences that brought followers closer to enlightenment. He staged loyalty tests called White Nights, emergency drills conducted in the middle of the night where members were awakened and told that government forces were attacking, that everyone must drink from cups that Jones claimed contained poison, that their willingness to die for the cause would prove their commitment. These rehearsals for mass suicide were presented afterward as tests, with Jones congratulating members for their faithfulness, but they served to normalize the concept of revolutionary suicide and to condition followers for the final act that would eventually come. As media scrutiny and defector testimonies began to threaten the People's Temple's operations in California, Jones convinced his followers that the only path to safety was to relocate to a remote agricultural project he had established in Guyana, a South American nation with a socialist-leaning government that welcomed the community. Nearly 1,000 members followed Jones to what he called Jonestown, a settlement carved from jungle in one of the most isolated regions of Guyana, accessible only by small aircraft or boat, separated from the outside world by geography that became another tool of control. Life in Jonestown was characterized by endless labor, inadequate food and medical care, armed guards who prevented anyone from leaving, and constant indoctrination through loudspeaker systems that broadcast Jones's increasingly paranoid sermons around the clock. Members who attempted to escape were tracked down and returned, subjected to public punishment, sometimes placed in a plywood box as solitary confinement, sometimes drugged with medications that left them confused and compliant. Jones himself descended into drug addiction, consuming Valium and other pharmaceuticals in quantities that left him slurring speeches and exhibiting erratic behavior, his paranoia intensifying as he became convinced that the CIA, the FBI, and various other government agencies were conspiring to destroy his socialist paradise. When Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown in November 1978 to investigate allegations of human rights abuses, accompanied by journalists and concerned relatives of temple members, Jones saw the visit as the beginning of the government attack he had long predicted. Several Jonestown residents approached Ryan's delegation asking to leave with them, a defection that Jones perceived as the ultimate betrayal and the trigger for the final act he had rehearsed dozens of times before. As Ryan's group prepared to board planes at a nearby airstrip, gunmen from Jonestown opened fire, killing the congressman, 3 journalists, and 1 defector, while wounding several others in an attack that Jones knew would bring immediate and overwhelming governmental response. Back at Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers and told them the time had come for revolutionary suicide, that they would die with dignity rather than allow their children to be tortured by fascist government forces. Large vats of grape-flavored flavor aid were mixed with cyanide, sedatives, and tranquilizers, and members were directed to drink while armed guards ensured compliance. Parents were instructed to administer the poison to their children first, using syringes to squirt the liquid into infants' moistomatic abuse, the financial fraud, the sexual exploitation, and the psychological manipulation that had characterized the People's Temple for years. But this knowledge came too late for the 909 victims, including 304 children, who died believing they were following a man of God. Survivors and defectors who had escaped before the final massacre provided testimony about the conditions in Jonestown, describing the starvation diets, the medical neglect, the physical abuse, the constant fear that permeated every aspect of life in the settlement. Family members of victims filed wrongful death lawsuits, though recovering damages from the defunct organization proved largely futile, the temple's assets having been depleted by Jones's grandiose projects and personal expenditures. The Jonestown Massacre fundamentally changed how American society viewed charismatic religious movements, leading to increased scrutiny of groups that exhibited cult-like characteristics and greater awareness of the manipulation techniques used by authoritative leaders. Yet justice in any meaningful sense was impossible because the perpetrator and most of his inner circle died alongside their victims, leaving only the inadequate satisfaction of historical condemnation and the painful knowledge that warning signs had been visible for years before the final tragedy. Former members grappled with guilt and trauma, questioning how they had been deceived so completely, how they had participated in or witnessed abuse without intervening effectively, and how they could rebuild lives shattered by the loss of loved ones and the destruction of their own moral certainty. The legacy of Jonestown remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute authority, the vulnerability of people seeking belonging and purpose, and the catastrophic consequences when a community's devotion to a leader supersedes their commitment to basic human dignity and survival. The phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" entered common usage as a reference to blind obedience, though the victims at Jonestown had no choice in their deaths, making the casual usage of this phrase particularly painful for survivors and victims' families. Decades later, recordings of the final moments at Jonestown remain some of the most disturbing documents of cult violence, capturing the sounds of children crying, members pleading for another solution, and Jones's relentless insistence that death was their only option, an audio testament to how completely one man's delusions destroyed nearly 1,000 lives while the world watched too late to intervene. Number 2. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. Vernon Wayne Howell, who would later adopt the name David Koresh, claiming to be the final prophet and the Lamb of God described in the Book of Revelation, took control of the Branch Davidian religious sect in the late 1980s after a power struggle that involved allegations of attempted murder and resulted in his undisputed leadership of a community that believed the end times were imminent. The Branch Davidians had existed as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church since the 1930s, establishing their compound called Mount Carmel outside Waco, Texas, where they awaited the apocalypse and studied biblical prophecy under various leaders who claimed special insight into God's plan. Koresh joined the group in 1981 as a young man with limited formal education but extraordinary charisma and an encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture that he could recite for hours, interpreting passages in ways that placed himself at the center of God's final plan for humanity. He began an affair with the then elderly prophet Lois Roden, whose position as leader of the Branch Davidians gave Koresh influence and access to the community, and when she died in 1986, Koresh engaged in a violent confrontation with her son George Roden for control of the group. This power struggle culminated in a shootout at Mount Carmel in 1987, after which Koresh and 7 followers were tried for attempted murder, resulting in a mistrial for Koresh and acquittals for the others, allowing him to return to Mount Carmel and claim leadership unopposed after George Roden was later imprisoned for an unrelated murder. Once in control, Koresh instituted a theological system called the New Light Revelation, which he claimed God had shown him directly, doctrines that gave him absolute authority over every aspect of his followers' lives, including their sexuality, their finances, their daily activities, and their family relationships. Central to his New Light theology was the claim that he alone among all men was entitled to have sexual relationships and produce children, that all other men in the community must be celibate, and that all women, including those already married, belonged spiritually and physically to Koresh as the chosen vessel of God. He systematically dissolved existing marriages within the community, explaining to husbands that their wives were actually Koresh's spiritual brides and that they should feel honored that God had chosen their spouses to bear the prophet's children. Some of these women were barely teenagers when Koresh designated them as his spiritual wives, with witnesses later testifying that Koresh had sexual relationships with girls as young as 12 years old, presenting these statutory rapes as religious obligations and sacred acts that would produce a special generation of children to rule during the millennium. Parents within the community accepted these arrangements because they believed Koresh was truly God's anointed prophet, because dissent meant expulsion from the only community they knew, and because Koresh's biblical knowledge and charismatic preaching created an environment where questioning his authority felt like questioning God himself. Life at the Mount Carmel compound revolved entirely around Koresh, who delivered rambling Bible studies that could last 8 hours or more, who controlled all communication with the outside world, who determined what foods members could eat and when they could sleep, and who stockpiled weapons he claimed would be necessary during the apocalyptic battle he believed was approaching. The community lived communally with inadequate sanitation and nutrition, children receiving minimal education beyond biblical study, members working without pay in businesses that generated income for the compound, and everyone subjected to Koresh's unpredictable rages and his detailed rules governing every aspect of behavior. Former members who left the group tried to raise alarms about the child abuse and the weapon stockpiling, providing testimony to authorities that eventually prompted investigations by Child Protective Services and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In February 1993, ATF agents attempted to execute a search warrant at Mount Carmel based on evidence that the Branch Davidians were illegally converting semi-automatic weapons to full automatic capability and possibly manufacturing destructive devices, violations of federal firearms laws that provided legal grounds for the raid. The operation went catastrophically wrong from the beginning, with the element of surprise lost when a local television cameraman asked for directions to the raid location, ensuring that Koresh knew law enforcement was approaching, and when ATF agents arrived at the compound they were met with gunfire from multiple locations. The resulting shootout lasted nearly 2 hours, killing 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians, wounding more than 20 others, and beginning a 51-day siege that would end in one of the deadliest law enforcement disasters in American history. The standoff became a media spectacle, with satellite trucks surrounding the compound, negotiators attempting to convince Koresh to surrender, and FBI tactical teams taking over from the ATF after the initial raid failed. Koresh engaged in lengthy phone negotiations, promising to surrender after he finished writing his interpretation of the 7 seals from the Book of Revelation, playing Christian rock music at negotiators, releasing some children but retaining most of his followers inside the compound while claiming that God was instructing him to wait. Negotiations dragged on for weeks with little progress, FBI agents growing increasingly frustrated with Koresh's delays and broken promises, tactical personnel arguing for aggressive action while behavioral experts urged patience, and Attorney General Janet Reno ultimately approving a plan to inject tear gas into the compound to force the Branch Davidians out. On April 19, 1993, FBI tanks began punching holes in the compound's walls and inserting CS gas, a chemical agent that causes severe burning of the eyes and respiratory system, intending to make conditions inside so intolerable that residents would have to evacuate. Instead, fires broke out simultaneously in multiple locations inside the compound around midday, flames spreading with extraordinary speed through the wooden structure, fanned by high winds that turned the entire complex into an inferno within minutes. 76 Branch Davidians died in the fire, including Koresh, who suffered a gunshot wound to the head that was either self-inflicted or administered by one of his lieutenants, and 25 children who perished in the flames or from smoke inhalation, their small bodies found clustered in interior rooms where they had sought shelter. The question of who started the fire became intensely controversial, with survivors and sympathizers claiming the FBI tanks had sparked the blaze either deliberately or accidentally, while government investigators concluded that Branch Davidians had poured fuel and started the fires themselves as a final act of religious martyrdom. A conclusion supported by audio surveillance that captured voices discussing spreading fuel shortly before the fires began. Investigations and congressional hearings followed, examining every aspect of the ATF raid and the FBI siege, with critics arguing that law enforcement had been far too aggressive in their initial approach and that alternatives to the tear gas assault should have been pursued, while defenders maintained that the Branch Davidians were heavily armed religious extremists who had already killed federal agents and who chose mass suicide over surrender. The surviving Branch Davidians faced criminal trials for the deaths of the ATF agents, with several convicted of lesser charges like aiding and abetting voluntary manslaughter rather than murder, receiving sentences that ranged from 5 to 40 years, though many of these convictions were later overturned or reduced on appeal. Civil lawsuits filed by survivors and victims' families against the government sought damages for wrongful death and excessive force, but courts ultimately ruled that law enforcement had acted within legal bounds and that the Branch Davidians themselves bore responsibility for the tragic outcome. The deeper questions about justice in the Waco siege are far more complex than criminal convictions or civil liability can address, because they involve systemic failures across multiple agencies and institutions over many years. Child Protective Services had investigated allegations of child abuse at Mount Carmel as early as 1992, but closed the case without removing any children, despite testimony from former members about Koresh's sexual relationships with minors, a failure of child protection that left vulnerable children in an abusive situation that would end with their deaths. Local law enforcement had opportunities to arrest Koresh during his frequent trips to town but deferred to federal authorities who were building a firearms case, missing chances to take him into custody without a high-risk raid on a fortified compound. The ATF's decision to proceed with a dynamic entry despite knowing they had lost the element of surprise has been criticized as tactically reckless, prioritizing the agency's desire for a successful high-profile operation over the safety of both agents and Branch Davidians. The FBI's escalation to tear gas despite warnings from experts that it might provoke mass suicide reflected impatience with negotiations and confidence in tactical solutions that proved tragically misplaced. Throughout the 51-day siege, opportunities for peaceful resolution were missed or abandoned, with behavioral experts who urged continued negotiation overruled by tactical commanders who viewed Koresh as a con man rather than a true believer, a misunderstanding of his psychology that contributed to the fatal miscalculation about how he would respond to the tear gas assault. The children who died at Waco were victims not only of Koresh's delusions and the choices of their parents who followed him, but also of institutional failures across multiple systems that should have protected them, from child welfare agencies that investigated but didn't intervene, to law enforcement agencies that chose confrontation over arrest opportunities, to tactical planners who approved an assault that put children at risk. The Branch Davidian tragedy demonstrates how justice delayed by bureaucratic inaction and interagency coordination failures can result in justice denied entirely, with child abuse victims never rescued and ultimately killed in the very raid meant to save them. The Waco siege also had profound unintended consequences for American domestic terrorism, as Timothy McVeigh attended the site during the standoff and later cited the government's actions at Waco as motivation for his bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building exactly 2 years later on April 19, 1995, an attack that killed 168 people, including 19 children, making Waco not only a tragedy in itself, but also an inspiration for an even greater act of violence. Survivors of the fire struggled with severe burns and trauma, some maintaining their faith in Koresh's teachings even after his death, others eventually coming to realize they had been manipulated and abused, all of them carrying the burden of having belonged to a community that ended in such catastrophic violence. The legacy of Waco continues to shape debates about religious freedom versus state intervention, about law enforcement tactics in standoff situations, and about how society should respond when charismatic leaders create isolated communities where abuse flourishes hidden from outside scrutiny. Documentary evidence gathered after the fire confirmed the systematic child sexual abuse, with testimony from survivors and physical evidence at the compound supporting accounts of Koresh's relationships with underage girls, validating the concerns that had prompted the original investigations but coming too late to help the children who died. The question of justice for the Branch Davidian children remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case, because the systems meant to protect them failed at every stage, and the ultimate intervention resulted in their deaths rather than their rescue, leaving only the cold comfort of historical condemnation for a man who can never face earthly consequences for his crimes. Number 3. Warren Jeffs and the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. Warren Steed Jeffs rose to leadership of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a polygamous sect that had split from the mainstream Mormon Church over the practice of plural marriage, after the death of his father Rulon Jeffs in 2002. Inheriting control over a community of approximately 10,000 followers living primarily in the twin border towns of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. The FLDS had existed for decades as an isolated fundamentalist community that practiced polygamy despite its prohibition under both state and federal law, with men taking multiple wives in spiritual marriages that were not legally recognized but were considered sacred and essential for achieving the highest level of heaven according to FLDS theology. Under Rulon Jeffs, the community had become increasingly insular and authoritarian, but Warren Jeffs took these tendencies to extremes that transformed the FLDS into what many former members and observers described as a cult characterized by absolute control, systematic child abuse, and the destruction of families that challenged his authority. Warren Jeffs had served as principal of the FLDS private school before assuming leadership, a position that gave him influence over the education and indoctrination of FLDS children, and after becoming prophet, he declared himself the literal voice of God on earth, claiming that obedience to him was identical to obedience to God, and that questioning his directives was apostasy punishable by expulsion and eternal damnation. He instituted a practice of reassigning wives and children from one man to another based on his determination of worthiness and obedience, breaking up families on whims or in response to perceived disobedience, giving men's wives and children to more faithful followers while banishing the original husbands from the community and from any contact with their families. These reassignments caused profound trauma, with children forcibly separated from fathers they had known their entire lives, told that their fathers were evil apostates unworthy of their love, and instructed to call their new assigned fathers Dad, and to forget their previous family relationships. Jeffs exercised complete control over who could marry within the FLDS, arranging all marriages himself, including marriages between adult men and girls as young as 12 or 13 years old, unions he described as ordained by God, but which constituted statutory rape and child sexual abuse under state laws. The arranged marriages followed no pattern based on mutual attraction or compatibility, but rather reflected Jeffs' determination of which young girls should be given to which adult men as rewards for faithfulness, with the girls having no say in these arrangements and being taught that refusing a marriage assignment was defying God's will and risking their eternal salvation. Life in the FLDS communities under Warren Jeffs' leadership was characterized by increasingly restrictive rules that governed every aspect of behavior, with bans on television, internet, newspapers, toys, bicycles, and most forms of recreation, requirements for specific styles of dress, including long prairie dresses for women and girls and long-sleeve shirts for men, and extensive regulations about religious observance, work requirements, and family structure. Jeffs delivered lengthy sermons that could last 6 hours or more, often broadcast to the community via audio systems, in which he expounded his theological interpretations and his directives about community life, creating a constant drumbeat of indoctrination and control that reinforced his authority and isolated members from outside influences. Education within FLDS schools was limited primarily to religious instruction and basic skills, with science and history taught from fundamentalist perspectives that rejected evolution and secular interpretations of human development, and with literature and arts restricted to materials approved by church leadership, ensuring that children grew up without exposure to ideas that might cause them to question FLDS teachings. Men within the FLDS competed for favor with Jeffs in hopes of being granted permission to marry multiple wives, since marriages were entirely in his control and only men he deemed sufficiently obedient and faithful were allowed to have families, creating a system where probably half of FLDS men were effectively excluded from marriage and family life, deemed unworthy and left in a permanent state of religious second-class citizenship. Young men and teenage boys who might represent competition for the young girls that elder men wanted to marry were frequently expelled from the community on pretexts as minor as wearing the wrong color shirt or listening to forbidden music, driven to the edge of FLDS towns and abandoned with no money, no education that prepared them for life in mainstream society, no family support since contact with apostates was forbidden, and often not even knowledge of their own legal birth dates or social security numbers. These lost boys, as they became known, numbered in the hundreds or possibly thousands over the years of Jeffs' leadership, young men cast out to protect the polygamous marriage system that required a surplus of available young women for older men, and while some lost boys eventually adapted to life outside the FLDS with help from ex-member support networks, others struggled with poverty, substance abuse, and the psychological trauma of complete family rejection. Former FLDS members who left the church began speaking to media and law enforcement about the child abuse, the forced marriages, and the authoritarian control that characterized the community, their testimony prompting investigations by Child Protective Services and law enforcement in both Utah and Arizona. In 2004, Warren Jeffs performed a spiritual marriage between himself and a 13-year-old girl, a crime that would eventually lead to his conviction but which at the time went undetected by authorities who were only beginning to understand the extent of abuse within the FLDS. As investigations intensified, Jeffs became increasingly paranoid, preaching that government persecution was imminent and that the faithful must prepare for the end times by remaining absolutely obedient to his commands. In 2005, he was charged in Arizona with arranging marriages between adult men and underage girls, crimes that made him a fugitive from justice and prompted him to go into hiding along with several of his most trusted followers. For more than a year, Jeffs evaded law enforcement while continuing to direct the FLDS through recorded messages and through loyal intermediaries who traveled to secret locations to receive his instructions, moving between safe houses and motels while using aliases and disguises, traveling with several of his wives who remained loyal despite his fugitive status. The FBI placed Jeffs on their 10 Most Wanted list in May 2006, bringing national attention to the case and increasing pressure on the FLDS communities that were harboring him or helping him evade capture. He was finally arrested in August 2006 during a routine traffic stop near Las Vegas, Nevada, when a Nevada Highway Patrol trooper pulled over the Cadillac Escalade in which Jeffs was traveling and became suspicious of the occupants, discovering large amounts of cash, multiple cell phones, disguises, and Jeffs himself attempting to conceal his identity, recognizing him from FBI wanted posters. At the time of his arrest, Jeffs was traveling with one of his wives and his brother, and a subsequent search of their vehicle revealed $54,000 in cash, 15 cell phones, 4 portable radios, 4 laptop computers, a police scanner, multiple wigs and disguises, and numerous prepaid credit cards, evidence of an elaborate system designed to help him remain on the run indefinitely. In 2007, Jeff stood trial in Utah on charges of being an accomplice to rape, specifically for arranging and performing a marriage between a 19-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl, then pressuring the girl to submit to sexual relations with her husband despite her repeated protests and attempts to resist. The victim, Alyssa Wall, testified at trial about how Jeffs had arranged her marriage to her first cousin Alan Steed despite her pleas that she was too young and did not want to marry, how Jeffs had counseled her to submit to her husband and fulfill her wifely duties, and how this counsel had resulted in repeated instances of non-consensual sexual contact that left her traumatized and suicidal but unable to escape because leaving would mean abandoning her family and her only community. Jeffs was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive prison terms of 5 years to life, but this conviction was overturned by the Utah Supreme Court in 2010 on the grounds that jury instructions had been flawed, a reversal that meant justice was delayed but not ultimately denied since by that time Texas prosecutors had filed even more serious charges. In 2008, Texas authorities had raided the FLDS's yearning for Zion Ranch near El Dorado, Texas, a sprawling compound that Jeffs had established as a refuge for his most devoted followers and where investigators believed systematic child abuse was occurring. The raid was prompted by phone calls to a domestic violence shelter from someone claiming to be a 16-year-old girl being abused at the ranch, calls that later proved to be a hoax perpetrated by someone not connected to the FLDS, but which nonetheless led to the largest child custody case in American history when authorities removed more than 400 children from the ranch. Although most of these children were eventually returned to their families after courts ruled the mass removal was legally unjustified, the investigation of the ranch yielded extensive evidence of underage marriages and sexual abuse, including photographs, records, and physical evidence that formed the basis for multiple prosecutions. Texas prosecutors charged Jeffs with sexual assault of a child and aggravated sexual assault of a child, crimes based on his spiritual marriages to and sexual relationships with underage girls, documented in photographs found at the ranch showing Jeffs kissing and embracing girls who were clearly children. In 2011, Jeffs stood trial in Texas, initially attempting to act as his own attorney and engaging in bizarre courtroom behavior that included attempting to dismiss his legal counsel, requesting multiple delays, and refusing to follow standard courtroom procedures, behavior that led the judge to appoint standby counsel over Jeffs' objections. During the trial, prosecutors presented a DNA evidence linking Jeffs to a child born to a 15-year-old FLDS girl, proving he had engaged in sexual relations with an underage victim, and they played an audio recording found at the YFC ranch that captured Jeffs giving instructions to 12-year-old girls on how to please him sexually. With the voices of young girls audible on the recording asking questions and responding to his directions, evidence so disturbing that some jurors were observed crying as it was played in court. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting Jeffs on both counts, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison plus 20 years, ensuring that he would die behind bars for his crimes against children. Even after his conviction and imprisonment, Jeffs initially continued to attempt to control the FLDS from his cell, issuing directives about community life, ordering mass marriages between randomly paired members, and preaching apocalyptic messages about imminent divine judgment. Though his influence gradually waned as reality set in that he would never be released, and as some FLDS members began to question whether a true prophet of God would be permanently imprisoned for such crimes. The communities of Hilldale and Colorado City struggled with the aftermath of Jeffs' leadership, with families divided between those who maintained faith in him and those who recognized the destruction his teachings had caused, and with economic devastation as the communal trust that had controlled much community property was placed under court supervision and many businesses collapsed without the FLDS system to support them. Civil lawsuits filed by former FLDS members sought damages for the abuse they had suffered, resulting in significant monetary judgments against Jeffs and the FLDS, though collecting these judgments proved difficult given the complex financial structures through which community assets had been hidden. The question of justice in Warren Jeffs' case is complicated by the decades during which his crimes were known to law enforcement and child protective services, but went unprosecuted, a delay caused partly by the difficulty of gathering evidence from an insular community where victims had been indoctrinated to see abuse as religiously mandated, partly by interjurisdictional complications between Utah and Arizona authorities who had historically been reluctant to prosecute polygamy cases, and partly by a cultural reluctance to intervene aggressively in religious communities even when abuse was suspected. Former FLDS members testified that authorities had received reports about forced underage marriages and child abuse for years before taking serious action, that girls had tried to run away and been returned to their families by police who didn't understand the context of what is happening, and that the FLDS leadership had operated with a sense of impunity because they had never faced real consequences for their crimes. The lost boys who had been expelled from the FLDS as teenagers found themselves without legal recourse for the deprivation of their childhoods and their families, since being expelled from a religious community is not itself a crime even when it constitutes abandonment of minors. Mothers whose children had been reassigned to other men had no legal standing to fight for custody since their spiritual marriages had never been legally recognized, leaving them unable to use family court systems to maintain relationships with their children. The systemic nature of abuse within the FLDS meant that hundreds of people had suffered harm for which criminal prosecution of Jeffs alone could never fully account, with many perpetrators of abuse never charged, because resources were focused on prosecuting the leader who had orchestrated the system. The children born as a result of Jeffs's statutory rapes, and those of other FLDS men following his directives, grew up with the knowledge that their very existence resulted from crimes, a psychological burden no amount of legal justice can erase. The failure of authorities to intervene earlier, despite numerous warning signs and multiple opportunities to investigate or prosecute, represents a systemic failure that allowed thousands of people to suffer abuse that could have been prevented or mitigated, making Warren Jeffs's eventual conviction a case of justice delayed by decades, during which countless victims received no protection or relief from the abuse they endured. Number 4. Tony Alamo and the Alamo Christian Foundation. Bernie Lazar Hoffman, who reinvented himself as Tony Alamo, built a religious empire beginning in the 1960s that combined fundamentalist Christian preaching with commercial enterprises and a celebrity following, presenting himself as a prophet with direct knowledge of God's will and establishing a church that would eventually become synonymous with systematic child abuse and exploitation. Alamo and his wife Susan founded the Alamo Christian Foundation in Los Angeles, attracting followers from the counterculture movement with a message that combined born-again Christianity with apocalyptic prophecy and harsh condemnation of mainstream society, operating street ministries that claimed to rehabilitate drug addicts and alcoholics through religious conversion and communal living. The ministry grew rapidly during the 1970s, establishing communes in multiple states where members lived under strict rules that required them to turn over their possessions and work without pay in church-owned businesses, including a lucrative operation manufacturing denim jackets that were sold to major retailers and generated millions of dollars in revenue. Members worked extensive hours in these businesses while living in overcrowded communal facilities with inadequate food and basic necessities, their labor enriching the Alamo organization while they received no wages and survived on subsistence-level provisions. Tony Alamo presented an image of prosperity and success, dressing in expensive suits, driving luxury cars, and maintaining lavish residences, all funded by the unpaid labor of his followers who believed they were serving God through their work. When Susan Alamo died from cancer in 1982, Tony Alamo refused to accept her death, claiming she would be resurrected and keeping her body on display in a climate-controlled glass-topped coffin at church headquarters for months, eventually moving the body to a secret location when authorities threatened to intervene, demonstrating a level of psychological delusion that should have raised serious questions about his fitness to lead a religious community. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, former members increasingly spoke out about abusive conditions within Alamo's organization, describing physical beatings, sleep deprivation, separation of families, and most disturbingly, allegations that Alamo was engaging in sexual relationships with underage girls within the ministry. These allegations prompted investigations by various agencies, but Alamo's organization moved frequently between Arkansas, California, and other states, making sustained investigation difficult, and the insular nature of the community made it challenging for authorities to gather evidence or identify willing witnesses. Alamo preached that he was under persecution by Satan working through government authorities, that investigations were proof of his righteous witness, and that members must remain loyal despite any accusations or external pressure, effectively inoculating his followers against believing negative information about him or his practices. Former members reported that Alamo taught a doctrine of spiritual marriage that allowed him to have multiple wives and to marry girls as young as 8 years old, unions he claimed were sanctioned by God and necessary for the girls' spiritual development, religious justifications for what constituted clear child sexual abuse. Girls within the organization were taught that being selected as Alamo's wife was a spiritual honor, that they must submit to whatever he demanded, and that speaking about these marriages outside the community would bring God's judgment upon them and their families. The abuse was systematic and long-term, with multiple victims spanning decades, yet prosecution was delayed by the difficulty of convincing victims to testify, the challenge of gathering evidence about crimes that occurred in private settings, and Alamo's ability to use his resources to fight legal challenges and to relocate his operations whenever investigations intensified. In 1994, Alamo was convicted of federal tax evasion charges for failing to pay taxes on the income generated by church businesses, sentenced to 6 years in prison, and ordered to pay millions in restitution to former members for unpaid labor, but these convictions did not address the more serious allegations of child abuse. Upon his release from prison in 1998, Alamo returned to ministry, re-establishing his organization primarily in Arkansas, and continuing many of the same practices that had characterized his previous operation, including the spiritual marriages to underage girls that had prompted earlier investigations. For nearly a decade after his release, Alamo continued to operate with relative impunity despite former members continuing to report abuse to authorities, a delay in justice that allowed more children to be victimized by a man who had already been identified as a danger. The breakthrough in building a successful prosecution came when several young women who had been Alamo's child brides found the courage to speak to investigators in detail about their experiences, providing testimony about sexual abuse that began when they were as young as 8 years old and continued for years as Alamo presented the abuse as religious obligation and spiritual marriage. In 2008, federal and state authorities raided Alamo's compound in Waco, Arkansas, removing children and gathering evidence that included photographs of Alamo with young girls, documents related to interstate transportation of minors, and testimony from compound residents about the living conditions and the marriages. Tony Alamo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of taking minors across state lines for illegal sexual purposes, violations of the Mann Act that carried serious federal penalties and that proved easier to prosecute than state-level child abuse charges because they involved clear interstate commerce elements and federal jurisdiction. During the 2009 trial in Texarkana, Arkansas, multiple victims testified about their experiences as Alamo's child brides, describing how he had married them in religious ceremonies when they were between 8 and 14 years old, how he had engaged in sexual contact with them repeatedly over years, how he had taken them across state lines to various Alamo properties as he moved his operations, and how he had taught them that this abuse was God's will and that they were specially chosen. The testimony was graphic and devastating, painting a picture of systematic sexual predation cloaked in religious authority, with victims describing how Alamo had controlled every aspect of their lives and used their faith and their isolation from the outside world to ensure their compliance and silence. Alamo's defense argued that the prosecution was religious persecution and that the relationships in question had been consensual spiritual marriages, arguments that the jury rejected after deliberating for approximately 3.5 hours, convicting Alamo on all 10 counts against him. At sentencing, the judge described Alamo's crimes as despicable and noted the extensive harm he had caused to his victims, sentencing him to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for the then 75-year-old defendant. Even after conviction, Alamo remained defiant, claiming he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs, that his accusers were liars motivated by Satan, and that God would vindicate him, demonstrating no remorse or acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. The civil aftermath of Alamo's criminal conviction included lawsuits by former members seeking damages for the years of unpaid labor and abuse they had suffered, resulting in judgments that awarded millions of dollars to plaintiffs, though recovering these amounts proved difficult as Alamo's assets were limited and much property was held in complex organizational structures. The Alamo organization fractured after his conviction, with some loyalists maintaining that he had been falsely accused while others finally acknowledged the abuse that had occurred and left the group, and with various splinter factions arguing about who should lead what remained of the ministry. Tony Alamo died in federal prison in 2017 at age 82, having served only 8 years of his sentence, his death eliminating any possibility of parole while also ending any hope his victims might have had of receiving meaningful apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing from their abuser. The question of justice in the Tony Alamo case is fundamentally about the decades-long delay between the first allegations of child abuse and the eventual prosecution that removed him from society, a delay during which numerous children were victimized by abuse that authorities knew was occurring but couldn't or wouldn't stop effectively. Former members reported making allegations to law enforcement and child protective services as early as the 1980s, describing the conditions in Alamo's compounds and the rumors of inappropriate relationships with minors, but these reports did not result in successful prosecution or even sustained investigation for more than 20 years. The challenges were significant and illustrate systemic problems in protecting children in insular religious communities, including the difficulty of getting victims who had been indoctrinated to see abuse as religious duty to cooperate with investigations, the complexity of interstate cases where abuse occurred in multiple jurisdictions making it unclear which agency had primary responsibility, the resource constraints that prevented sustained investigation of a sophisticated organization that could afford legal defense, and perhaps most significantly, a historical reluctance by authorities to intervene aggressively in religious communities even when abuse was suspected because of concerns about appearing to violate religious freedom. Former followers who tried to help their children escape Alamo's control faced legal obstacles because in many cases their children had been legally adopted by Alamo or other organization members, meaning that parents who left the organization had no legal custody of their own children and no standing to seek their return. The children who grew up in Alamo's organization received inadequate education, lived in conditions of poverty despite the wealth their labor generated, suffered physical abuse that was rationalized as biblical discipline, and in many cases were sexually abused by Alamo himself. Yet Child Protective Services conducted multiple investigations over the years without removing children permanently or building successful cases against the organization. Some victims of Alamo's abuse did not come forward for decades after leaving the organization, struggling with shame, confusion about whether what they experienced constituted abuse, fear of retribution, and lack of support systems, meaning that even after his conviction there were likely victims whose experiences were never documented or addressed in any legal proceeding. The community of Fouke, Arkansas, where Alamo's final compound was located, struggled with the aftermath of his presence, with residents describing fear and intimidation during the years Alamo operated there, property values depressed by proximity to the compound, and children from the compound occasionally appearing in town showing signs of neglect and fear. The broader religious landscape failed these victims as well, with mainstream Christian denominations generally avoiding engagement with fringe groups like Alamo's ministry and thereby missing opportunities to offer alternative interpretations of Christianity that might have helped isolated members recognize that Alamo's teachings were aberrant. Educational systems failed to protect these children because Alamo ran unlicensed schools where education was minimal and religious indoctrination was primary, yet education authorities in multiple states allowed these schools to operate without effective oversight or intervention. The eventual justice achieved through Alamo's conviction came too late for the generations of children who grew up in his organization and suffered abuse that marked them permanently, and came only after enough victims found the courage and support to testify publicly about experiences they had been taught to hide and to feel ashamed about. The case demonstrates how predators can use religious authority and organizational isolation to victimize children systematically over decades, while authorities struggle to build cases that overcome legal obstacles and resource constraints, resulting in justice delayed so long that it can never fully address the scope of harm that occurred. Number 5. Keith Raniere and the NXIVM cult. Keith Allen Raniere founded what he called Executive Success Programs in 1998, a personal and professional development company that offered multi-day seminars promising to help participants overcome psychological and emotional barriers to success through a methodology Raniere claimed was based on ethical principles and scientific research. The organization operated under the name NXIVM, pronounced as NXIVM, and initially attracted thousands of participants, including successful professionals, actors, and wealthy individuals seeking self-improvement, with the Albany, New York-based company generating millions of dollars through expensive courses and recruiting a dedicated following who viewed Raniere as a brilliant philosopher and humanitarian. Raniere, who had previously been involved in a multi-level marketing scheme that had been investigated as a pyramid operation, presented himself as one of the world's most intelligent people, claiming an IQ of 240 and expertise in mathematics, science, philosophy, and psychology despite having no advanced degrees or legitimate credentials in any of these fields. He required his followers to address him as Vanguard, a title meant to signify his role as humanity's leader into an enlightened future, while his longtime partner Nancy Salzman, a trained nurse who became NXIVM's president, was called prefect, and together they created a hierarchical structure where advancement required taking increasingly expensive courses and recruiting others into the organization. NXIVM's curriculum appeared on the surface to be typical self-help content about ethics, values, and personal growth, but the methodology incorporated techniques that critics and former members described as manipulative and psychologically harmful, including intensive interrogation-style sessions where participants were pressed to reveal their deepest secrets and vulnerabilities, exercises designed to break down psychological defenses and create emotional dependency on the organization, and teachings that positioned Raniere as the ultimate arbiter of truth and ethical behavior. Members were encouraged to recruit family and friends into NXIVM, to take additional expensive courses, and to dedicate increasing amounts of time to the organization's activities, creating an environment where NXIVM became central to participants' social networks, self-concepts, and daily lives. For years, NXIVM operated as a controversial but apparently legal self-help organization, attracting media attention and criticism from cult experts and from some former members who described it as manipulative and psychologically abusive, but facing no serious legal challenges until allegations emerged about a secret women's group within NXIVM that involved practices constituting sexual exploitation and forced labor. In approximately 2015, Raniere created a secret sorority called DOS, which stood for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Latin for Lord/Master of the Obedient Female Companions, though members were told it meant something innocuous like dominant over submission, a women's empowerment group that would help participants overcome their weaknesses and fears. DOS was structured as a pyramid scheme within NXIVM, with Raniere at the top as the ultimate master served by a first line of slaves who were actually leading members of NXIVM, including television actress Allison Mack, and each of these first-line slaves recruiting their own slaves who in turn recruited their own slaves, creating a structure where women served masters above them and commanded slaves below them, all ultimately serving Raniere. Women recruited into DOS were told they were joining an exclusive women's mentorship society and were required to provide collateral before being admitted, which meant providing damaging material such as nude photographs, videos of themselves making false accusations against family members, access to bank accounts, or other information that could destroy their reputations or relationships if released. Once inducted, DOS members were told that this collateral would be released if they broke their vows of secrecy or disobeyed orders from their masters, ensuring compliance through blackmail and fear rather than through genuine consent. DOS members were required to maintain very low-calorie diets that left them constantly hungry and thinking about food, to follow strict sleep schedules including being available to respond to messages at any hour of day or night, to perform assignments for their masters that could include intensive labor, to engage in sexual acts with Raniere if ordered by their masters, and to attend ceremonies where they were branded with a cauterizing pen on their pelvic regions with a symbol that incorporated Raniere's and Allison Mack's initials. The branding ceremonies involved women holding down the initiate, while another member used a cauterizing pen to slowly burn the symbol into their flesh without any anesthetic, a process that took approximately 30 minutes and caused excruciating pain, with participants told that the ceremony was necessary to demonstrate their commitment and that the pain would help them transcend their limitations. Women in DOS were taught that serving Raniere sexually was an honor and an opportunity for growth, that any discomfort or unwillingness they felt reflected their own psychological issues that needed to be overcome, and that they should be grateful for his attention and the opportunity to help him with his needs. Several DOS members were essentially kept as sex slaves, living in a house where Raniere could access them, following extreme dietary restrictions that left them dangerously underweight, deprived of adequate sleep through late-night demands, and required to have sexual contact with Raniere whether they wanted to or not, all while believing they were participating in a program for their own personal development. The manipulation was sophisticated and multilayered, with victims believing they had chosen to participate even as they were coerced through psychological pressure, blackmail via collateral, carefully constructed teachings that made them doubt their own perceptions and judgments, and social structures that isolated them from outside perspectives and made them dependent on NXIVM for their entire sense of identity and community. In 2017, former DOS members began speaking to media about their experiences, with the New York Times publishing an explosive article that detailed the branding ceremonies, the sexual exploitation, and the blackmail used to maintain control. These revelations prompted additional former members to come forward and prompted law enforcement investigation into NXIVM's practices. In 2018, federal authorities arrested Raniere in Mexico, where he had fled along with several loyalists as investigations intensified, and he was charged with racketeering conspiracy, racketeering, forced labor conspiracy, sex trafficking conspiracy, and sex trafficking. Several of Raniere's co-defendants, including Nancy Salzman, her daughter Lauren Salzman, Allison Mack, and NXIVM bookkeeper Kathy Russell, entered guilty pleas and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, providing testimony about the inner workings of NXIVM and DOS and about Raniere's control over these operations. During the 2019 trial in federal court in Brooklyn, prosecutors presented testimony from former NXIVM members, including women who had been in DOS, describing the coercion they experienced, the sexual exploitation they suffered, and the psychological manipulation that had made them vulnerable to Raniere's control. One witness testified that Raniere had begun having sexual contact with her when she was 15 years old, and that he had produced child pornography by photographing her in sexualized poses, crimes that added child exploitation charges to the indictment. Witnesses described how Raniere had isolated them from family and friends who questioned NXIVM, how he had created psychological dependency through intensive interrogation sessions and teachings that positioned him as the ultimate authority on truth and ethics, and how DOS had used their own stated desires for growth and empowerment to manipulate them into accepting abuse. The defense argued that NXIVM participants were consenting adults who had joined voluntarily and who could have left at any time, but prosecutors demonstrated that the collateral system, the psychological manipulation, and the carefully constructed environment of coercion meant that consent had not been truly voluntary or informed. The jury convicted Raniere on all counts after less than 5 hours of deliberation, and in 2020 the judge sentenced him to 120 years in prison, ensuring he would die behind bars, describing him as ruthless and unyielding in his pursuit of power and sexual gratification, and noting the severe harm he had caused to numerous victims. Allison Mack was sentenced to 3 years in prison for her role as a DOS master who had recruited and commanded slaves, while other co-defendants received sentences ranging from probation to prison terms based on their levels of involvement and cooperation. Civil lawsuits filed by former NXIVM members sought damages for the fraud, forced labor, and other harm they experienced, resulting in settlements and judgments, though recovering significant damages proved difficult as NXIVM's assets had been depleted through years of spending on Raniere's lifestyle and legal defense. The question of justice in the NXIVM case involves examining why an organization that was practicing forced labor, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking operated for years in upstate New York without effective intervention despite numerous warning signs and complaints to authorities. Former members had been speaking out about NXIVM's psychological manipulation and abusive practices since at least the early 2000s, with media coverage describing the organization as cult-like and detailing concerning practices, yet these reports did not result in serious investigation or prosecution until the DOS allegations emerged. Part of the delay resulted from the sophisticated nature of NXIVM's manipulation, which made it difficult for victims themselves to recognize they were being abused and therefore unlikely to file complaints or cooperate with investigations, with many former members only coming to understand the extent of their exploitation years after leaving the organization. The use of collateral meant that victims feared coming forward because doing so could result in the release of damaging material, creating a system where the mechanism of abuse also served as insurance against exposure. NXIVM had resources to fight legal challenges, with expensive attorneys and public relations professionals working to discredit critics and to position media coverage as persecution of an unconventional but legitimate organization. Local law enforcement may have been hesitant to investigate aggressively an organization that included prominent local businesspeople and that had not generated complaints from victims who clearly identified themselves as such, since people involved with NXIVM generally described their participation as voluntary even when outsiders could see coercive elements. The multi-jurisdictional nature of NXIVM's operations, with activities spanning multiple states and countries, created coordination challenges for investigation and prosecution, requiring federal involvement but perhaps delaying action as various agencies determined jurisdiction and built cases. Perhaps most significantly, many of NXIVM's most abusive practices occurred within DOS, which didn't begin until approximately 2015, meaning that while NXIVM had existed as a controversial organization for nearly 2 decades, the clearly criminal conduct that led to prosecution was more recent and more hidden than the earlier psychological manipulation that had characterized the wider organization. The women who suffered sexual exploitation and forced labor in DOS were victims of crimes that occurred while NXIVM was already under scrutiny, suggesting that the earlier attention had not been sufficient to prevent Raniere from escalating to more serious criminal behavior within a more secretive subset of the organization. Victims who testified at trial described carrying shame and confusion for years about their experiences, questioning whether they had truly been abused or whether they bore responsibility for staying in situations that harmed them, reflecting the psychological complexity of manipulation-based abuse, where victims' own stated choices are used as weapons against them. The branding of women with Raniere's initials left physical scars that served as permanent reminders of their victimization, marks they would carry for life even after Raniere's conviction, a form of harm that no amount of legal justice can undo. Former members struggled with rebuilding careers and relationships after leaving NXIVM, often having burned bridges with family and friends during their involvement, having spent enormous amounts of money on courses, and having devoted years to an organization that had exploited rather than developed them. The delay in prosecution meant that some victims suffered for years longer than necessary, that Raniere was able to create DOS and victimize a new group of women even as earlier concerns about NXIVM circulated, and that the organization was able to continue recruiting new members who might have been deterred by more aggressive earlier intervention. The eventual convictions and serious prison sentences represent justice achieved, but cannot restore the years of life that victims lost to NXIVM's exploitation or erase the psychological and physical harm they suffered, making this another case where delayed justice meant that the full scope of harm could never be adequately addressed or remedied through legal proceedings alone. Number 6. Peter Popoff. Peter Popoff rose to prominence during the 1980s as a televangelist who claimed to perform miraculous healings through the power of God, broadcasting his ministry on television stations across the United States and holding massive revival meetings where thousands of desperate people sought cures for cancer, blindness, paralysis, and other serious medical conditions. Popoff's performances followed a familiar pattern in faith-healing crusades, with the evangelist calling out specific audience members by name, revealing their medical conditions and personal information that he claimed God was revealing to him directly, and then commanding diseases to leave their bodies through prayer and the laying on of hands. Wheelchair-bound attendees would rise and walk. Those claiming blindness would remove their glasses and declare sight restored, Individuals with tumors would testify that they could feel growths disappearing from their bodies, and Popoff would attribute these apparent miracles to the power of God working through his ministry, urging viewers at home to support his work through donations that would bring them blessings and healing. The ministry generated millions of dollars annually through these donations, with Popoff and his wife Elizabeth living in luxury while presenting themselves as humble servants of God who needed financial support to continue their healing mission. The truth behind Popoff's apparent miracles was exposed in 1986 by skeptic investigator James Randi and his colleague Steve Shaw, who attended Popoff crusades with radio equipment capable of intercepting electronic transmissions. They discovered that Popoff was receiving information through a tiny radio receiver hidden in his ear, with his wife Elizabeth reading details from prayer cards that audience members had filled out before the service, providing Popoff with names, addresses, and medical conditions that he could then present as divine revelation. The prayer cards, which attendees were asked to complete when they entered the venue as a way to focus their faith, were actually intelligence-gathering tools that gave the Popoffs detailed information about everyone in the audience who was hoping for healing. As Elizabeth read these details to her husband over the radio transmission, Popoff would theatrically claim that God was revealing information to him, creating the appearance of supernatural knowledge when he was actually receiving very earthly information through electronic means. Randi presented his findings on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, playing audio recordings of Elizabeth Popoff feeding information to her husband during crusades, exposing the entire operation as an elaborate fraud designed to extract money from vulnerable people desperate for healing. The revelation was devastating to Popoff's ministry, with donations dropping sharply as the fraud became public knowledge, and the organization filed for bankruptcy in 1987, claiming debts of more than $10 million, though critics noted that the Popoffs retained significant personal assets even as the ministry collapsed. For several years, Popoff disappeared from public view, and many assumed his career as a televangelist was permanently ended by the exposure of his fraudulent methods. However, by the mid-1990s, Popoff had returned to television with a new version of his ministry that was remarkably similar to the old one, again claiming healing powers, and now also offering miracle spring water and prayer cloths that he claimed were imbued with divine power and would bring healing and prosperity to those who used them. The new Popoff ministry targeted primarily elderly viewers and people of color. Demographics research showed were more likely to trust televangelist pitches and used late-night and early-morning television time slots that were less expensive, but still reached millions of potential donors. Popoff's mailings to supporters promised that God would provide financial windfalls, heal diseases, and solve personal problems if recipients would use the miracle water or prayer cloth and return a donation to the ministry, creating a cycle where vulnerable people sent money hoping for the blessings that were promised, but never materialized. Investigative journalists who examined the miracle spring water found it was ordinary tap water with no special properties whatsoever, while the prayer cloths were mass-produced fabric with no religious significance, yet people desperate for help continued to send donations in response to Popoff's promises. By the 2000s, Popoff's revived ministry was generating revenue estimated at more than $23 million annually, with the ministry operating out of upscale offices in California, while Popoff lived in a multi-million-dollar home and flew in private jets, all funded by donations from people who believed they were supporting a legitimate healing ministry. Former employees of the ministry came forward describing the operation as a cynical business focused entirely on maximizing donations, with sophisticated marketing targeting the most vulnerable potential donors, carefully scripted mailings designed to create emotional urgency, and follow-up systems that continued to solicit money from people who had already donated. The testimonials featured in Popoff broadcasts and mailings were often from people paid to provide positive statements or were taken so far out of context that they misrepresented what the person was actually claiming. Despite the earlier exposure of his fraudulent methods, despite the obviously false claims about miracle water and prayer cloths, despite the evidence that his ministry was operating as a for-profit business enriching the Popoffs rather than a charitable religious organization, Peter Popoff continued to operate largely without legal consequences beyond occasional regulatory actions by states concerned about charitable solicitation practices. The question of why Popoff faced no serious criminal prosecution despite clear evidence of fraud, both in the 1980s and after his return to television, reveals significant gaps in consumer protection and religious fraud enforcement. During the initial exposure in 1986, prosecutors apparently determined that proving criminal fraud would be difficult because Popoff could claim sincere religious belief in his healing powers even if his methods were deceptive, and because victims would need to testify that they had relied on specific false promises in making donations, a difficult standard when religious donations are generally viewed as gifts rather than purchases of services. The bankruptcy filing that followed the exposure discharged many of the ministry's debts without requiring the Popoffs to liquidate their personal assets, demonstrating how religious organizations can use bankruptcy protections while their leaders retain personal wealth. When Popoff returned to television in the 1990s using remarkably similar fraudulent methods, he apparently calculated correctly that the earlier exposure had not resulted in criminal charges and was unlikely to be pursued by authorities more than a decade later, and that a new generation of vulnerable people would not necessarily know about his history. Regulatory oversight of religious organizations and charitable solicitations is fragmented across federal and state agencies, with many religious groups claiming exemption from requirements that apply to secular charities, and with enforcement resources limited especially for cases involving donors who may not realize they have been defrauded or may be unwilling to admit they were deceived. The Federal Trade Commission, which has authority over false advertising, has historically been reluctant to pursue religious organizations for claims about spiritual or health benefits, perhaps because of First Amendment concerns about government entanglement with religion, and because the line between religious belief and fraudulent misrepresentation can be difficult to define legally. State attorneys general occasionally took action against Popoff for deceptive charitable solicitation, but these cases generally resulted in modest fines or requirements to include certain disclosures in mailings rather than criminal charges or orders to cease operations entirely. The people defrauded by Popoff often did not realize they had been victims or were too embarrassed to report their losses, particularly when the amounts involved were relatively small individual donations, even though they accumulated to millions in total. Many victims were elderly individuals with limited resources who sent money hoping for healing or financial help, making them particularly vulnerable and particularly unlikely to navigate the complex process of filing complaints or pursuing legal action. The faith element of religious fraud creates unique challenges because victims may maintain belief in the religious leader even when confronted with evidence of deception, interpreting lack of healing or promised blessings as failures of their own faith rather than fraud by the evangelist. Medical harm was another dimension of Popoff's fraud that went largely unaddressed legally, because people who delayed or discontinued legitimate medical treatment in favor of his prayer water and faith healing received no tangible accountability when they suffered disease progression or death as a result. The families of people who died after following Popoff's advice to trust God rather than doctors faced significant obstacles to proving causation and pursuing wrongful death claims, particularly when the deceased had made their own choices about medical care, even if those choices were influenced by fraudulent promises. The broader televangelism industry continued to operate with minimal regulation despite Popoff's example demonstrating how easily fraudulent operators could exploit religious faith for profit, with numerous other ministries making similar claims about healing, prosperity, and divine favor in exchange for donations, creating an environment where fraud was effectively normalized as an unfortunate but tolerated aspect of religious broadcasting. Attempts to strengthen oversight or create new enforcement mechanisms faced opposition from religious freedom advocates who argued that regulation would infringe on First Amendment protections, even when the regulations targeted clear fraud rather than legitimate religious practice. The decades that Popoff operated with impunity, both before and after his exposure, represent a systemic failure to protect vulnerable consumers from religious fraud, a failure rooted in legal ambiguities about what constitutes fraud versus religious expression, in resource limitations that make complex fraud cases low priorities for prosecutors, in fragmented jurisdiction between federal and state authorities, and in cultural reluctance to scrutinize religious organizations as aggressively as secular businesses, even when their practices are virtually identical. Peter Popoff continues to operate his ministry as of recent years, still selling Miracle Spring water and prayer cloths, still promising divine intervention in exchange for donations, still enriching himself at the expense of vulnerable believers, all despite multiple exposures of his fraudulent methods and decades of evidence that his promises are false, demonstrating how difficult it is to achieve meaningful justice when religious fraud intersects with First Amendment protections and when victims are simultaneously believers who may resist recognizing they have been exploited. Number 7. Ernest Angley. Ernest Angley built a prominent Pentecostal healing ministry beginning in the 1950s, broadcasting his services on television stations worldwide, claiming to perform miracles including curing cancer and AIDS through the power of prayer, and attracting thousands of followers to his Grace Cathedral Church in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, where he served as pastor for more than 6 decades. Angley's flamboyant style included wearing an obvious toupee that he acknowledged but claimed was his actual hair, dramatic healing services where he would strike people on the forehead causing them to fall backward in what followers called being slain in the spirit, and bold pronouncements about moral issues, particularly regarding sexuality, which he preached about frequently and in graphic detail. For decades, Angley enjoyed a reputation as a respected, if somewhat eccentric religious figure in his community, operating a cathedral that could seat several thousand people, maintaining a television broadcast seen in millions of homes, and running various charitable programs and businesses, including an airline catering service that employed church members. Behind this public image, according to extensive testimony from former church members and employees, Angley was systematically sexually abusing men in his congregation through practices he justified as spiritual counseling, but which constituted clear sexual assault. Multiple former members reported that Angley would call them into his office for private counseling sessions during which he would ask intrusive questions about their sex lives, examine their genitals ostensibly to ensure they were not masturbating or engaging in sinful sexual behavior, and in some cases touch them sexually, while claiming this was necessary spiritual guidance. Young men in the church reported being asked about the frequency of their erections, being required to expose themselves during counseling sessions, being touched inappropriately during what Angley claimed were examinations to ensure spiritual purity, and being told that these invasive interactions were mandated by God and necessary for their spiritual development. Angley preached extensively against homosexuality from the pulpit, condemning it as sinful and evil, even while, according to multiple accounts, he was engaging in sexual conduct with men in his congregation, a hypocrisy that compounded the violation and created additional shame for victims who were receiving contradictory messages about sexuality. Women in the church reported that Angley pressured married couples to undergo vasectomies and tubal ligations to prevent pregnancy, arguing that having children would interfere with service to God, and that he personally inquired into the sexual relationships of married couples in ways that were inappropriate and controlling. Former members described an environment where Angley exercised totalizing control over followers' personal lives, where questioning his authority was presented as rebellion against God, where members were expected to work long hours for church businesses, often without adequate compensation, and where those who challenged Angley or left the church were shunned and condemned. The abuse continued for decades, with many victims afraid to speak out because of Angley's power within their community, because they had been taught that he was God's anointed representative whose authority could not be questioned, and because they feared the social and spiritual consequences of accusing a prominent religious leader. In 2012, an investigation by a local television station interviewed former church members who described the sexual abuse and the controlling environment at Grace Cathedral, bringing public attention to allegations that had circulated privately for years but had not resulted in any official investigation or accountability. The reports prompted additional former members to come forward with similar accounts, creating a pattern of testimony about decades of abuse by Angley that extended back to at least the 1970s, if not earlier. Despite these public allegations supported by multiple witnesses describing similar experiences, law enforcement did not pursue criminal charges against Angley, partly because many of the alleged incidents occurred decades earlier and were beyond statutes of limitations, partly because proving sexual assault cases based on testimony without physical evidence is challenging, and partly because the victims were adults who might be characterized as having participated willingly even if they were manipulated or coerced through religious authority. Angley denied all allegations of sexual abuse, claiming he had only been providing appropriate pastoral counseling and that former members were lying as revenge for having been disciplined for their own sins. In 2017, Angley settled a lawsuit filed by a former church employee who claimed he had been wrongfully terminated and defamed after rejecting Angley's sexual advances, with the settlement terms kept confidential but representing some acknowledgement that the claims had merit even without admission of wrongdoing. Church membership declined significantly after the abuse allegations became public, with many longtime members leaving and taking their families with them, shocked by the revelations and betrayed by a man they had trusted as a spiritual guide. The charitable and business operations associated with Grace Cathedral struggled as donations decreased and as reputational damage made it difficult to attract customers or support. Ernest Angley continued to preach at Grace Cathedral until shortly before his death in 2021 at age 99, never facing criminal charges for the sexual abuse alleged by numerous former members, never being held accountable through any ecclesiastical proceedings since his church operated independently without denominational oversight, and never acknowledging wrongdoing or apologizing to those who said he had harmed them. The question of justice in the Ernest Angley case is particularly troubling because the allegations were numerous, consistent, and credible, yet resulted in no criminal prosecution and minimal civil liability despite decades of reported abuse. The delay in victims coming forward can be understood in the context of the shame and confusion that often accompanies sexual abuse, particularly when the perpetrator is a religious authority figure who frames the abuse as spiritual guidance, and particularly in religious communities where questioning leadership is equated with losing salvation. Many victims only recognize their experiences as abuse years after leaving the church, when they gained distance from Angley's influence and learned about sexual misconduct and manipulation tactics, meaning that by the time they were ready to report, statutes of limitations had often expired. Ohio law regarding sexual assault has statutes of limitations that can bar prosecution for crimes that occurred more than a certain number of years earlier, though these limitations have been extended in recent years partly in recognition of how long it takes many victims to come forward. But these extensions did not apply retroactively to crimes like Angley's that occurred decades ago. The adult status of Angley's victims created legal complexities because while the power dynamics and religious coercion created an environment where consent was questionable, prosecutors would face challenges proving that adult men had not participated willingly in what Angley characterized as counseling sessions even if the power imbalance and manipulation were clear to observers. The religious context provided Angley with defenses that secular authority figures might not have, with his attorneys able to argue that intimate counseling conversations were protected religious exercise, that his examinations of men's genitals were part of spiritual accountability practices, and that prosecuting these actions would constitute government interference with religion, arguments that prosecutors may have viewed as obstacles to successful prosecution. The independent nature of Angley's church meant there was no denominational hierarchy to investigate or discipline him, no bishop or oversight board with authority to remove him from ministry, leaving his continued leadership entirely within his own control and the control of church trustees who were loyal to him. Media coverage of the allegations, while bringing public attention, may have actually made prosecution more difficult by potentially tainting a jury pool or by giving Angley's legal team arguments that he could not receive a fair trial due to pretrial publicity. The decline in church attendance and financial support that followed the allegations represented a form of social accountability, but provided no direct justice to victims who had suffered abuse, no mechanism for acknowledgement of harm or provision of restitution or support for those harmed. The settlement of the civil lawsuit provided some vindication for one victim but required confidentiality that prevented public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and therefore limited its value in creating broader accountability or awareness. Former members who were not direct victims of sexual abuse, but who had been manipulated into working for church businesses without fair compensation or who had been pressured into unwanted medical procedures had no clear legal recourse for these harms, which might not constitute crimes, but certainly represented exploitation. The children raised in Grace Cathedral who grew up in an environment of manipulation and control, who witnessed their parents' devotion to a leader who was abusing his authority, who received limited education and were socialized into patterns of unhealthy spiritual dependence, suffered long-term harm that no legal proceeding could adequately address, even if Angli had been prosecuted. The broader Pentecostal and evangelical communities largely did not address the Angli case, with few prominent religious leaders speaking out about the allegations or using them as an opportunity to discuss preventing abuse in church settings, representing a failure of moral and ecclesiastical accountability that paralleled the failure of legal accountability. The fact that Angli died without facing trial, without serving prison time, without being defrocked or removed from ministry, without being required to acknowledge his victims or provide them with any form of restitution or apology, demonstrates how completely justice was delayed and ultimately denied to those he abused over decades of ministry. With only the limited accountability that came from public exposure and declining support for his ministry serving as consequences for a pattern of sexual abuse that victimized numerous people across many years. Number 8. Rajneesh. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho, was an Indian spiritual teacher who established an ashram in Pune, India, during the 1970s that attracted thousands of Western followers seeking enlightenment through a combination of meditation, therapy, and the celebration of sexuality that mainstream religions condemned. Rajneesh preached a philosophy that combined elements of Eastern spirituality with Western psychology, advocating for spiritual awakening through uninhibited expression of desires, including sexual desires, and attracting followers who appreciated his rejection of traditional religious morality and his promise of personal transformation through radical freedom. By the early 1980s, Rajneesh's ashram in India faced increasing conflict with local authorities and neighbors concerned about the group's activities, prompting his followers to search for a location where they could establish a larger and more autonomous community. In 1981, followers purchased a large ranch near Antelope, Oregon, and began developing what they called Rajneeshpuram, an intentional community where thousands of Rajneesh's disciples, known as sannyasins, moved to create a self-sufficient city dedicated to their master's teachings. The sannyasins transformed the rural ranch property into an elaborate settlement with residential buildings, farms, meditation facilities, an airstrip, a shopping mall, and infrastructure capable of supporting thousands of residents, financed by wealthy followers who donated their assets to the movement and by businesses the community operated. Rajneesh himself lived in luxury at the ranch, owning a collection of 93 Rolls-Royce automobiles that he would drive slowly past his followers who lined up to see him during daily drive-bys, a display of material wealth that he claimed demonstrated enlightenment beyond conventional values, but which struck critics as simple greed dressed in spiritual language. The relationship between Rajneeshpuram and the surrounding rural communities was hostile from the beginning, with longtime Oregon residents viewing the sannyasins as an invasive cult threatening their way of life, and the sannyasins viewing locals as narrow-minded bigots who couldn't understand their spiritual mission. As the community grew, conflicts intensified over land use regulations, incorporation as a city, immigration status of foreign followers, and control over local government in Waco County, where Rajneeshpuram was located. The sannyasins' leadership, particularly Ma Anand Sheela, who served as Rajneesh's secretary and de facto leader of the community, since Rajneesh himself remained largely silent after declaring a period of public silence in 1981, became increasingly aggressive in attempting to control local politics to protect the community from what they perceived as persecution. In 1984, as Waco County elections approached, Sheela and other Rajneeshpuram leaders orchestrated an elaborate scheme to affect the election outcome by busing thousands of homeless people from across the United States to the ranch, registering them to vote in Waco County, and planning to use their votes to elect Rajneeshpuram candidates who would prevent local officials from shutting down the community. To suppress the votes of Antelope residents who were likely to oppose Rajneeshpuram candidates, Sheela organized the first bioterrorism attack in United States history, a plot to sicken enough voters that they would be unable to vote on Election Day, thereby reducing opposition turnout and increasing the relative impact of Rajneeshpuram votes. Sheela and other leadership members cultivated salmonella bacteria in a laboratory at the ranch, then dispatched teams to contaminate salad bars at restaurants in the Dallas, Oregon, the county seat, targeting locations where locals ate and where people would gather during the election period. The conspirators poured salmonella-laced water onto salad bars, into salad dressing containers, and onto other food items at multiple restaurants, coffee creamers at stores, and even into the courthouse coffee station, successfully contaminating food that hundreds of people would consume. The resulting outbreak sickened 751 people with salmonella poisoning, making it the largest bioterrorism attack in United States history and one of the worst food poisoning outbreaks recorded in the country, with victims suffering severe gastrointestinal illness including vomiting, diarrhea, fever, and abdominal cramps, and with several people requiring hospitalization for dehydration and complications. At the time, health authorities investigated the outbreak as a possible accident involving contaminated food sources or improper food handling, not immediately suspecting that the outbreak was a deliberate attack, since bioterrorism was virtually unheard of in the United States and since the motive of vote suppression was not initially apparent. The plot ultimately failed to achieve its goal because the imported homeless voters created such public attention and legal challenges that many were not able to vote, and because the salmonella outbreak occurred several weeks before the actual election rather than on election day itself, allowing most victims to recover before voting. In September 1985, Ma Anand Sheila and several other Rajneeshpuram leaders suddenly fled to Europe amid growing internal conflicts within the community and increasing external investigations into various criminal activities at the ranch. Rajneesh, ending his period of public silence, held press conferences accusing Sheila and her associates of numerous crimes including the poisoning attack, wiretapping, immigration fraud, arson, and attempted murder, presenting himself as an innocent spiritual leader who had been deceived and manipulated by his secretary and her accomplices. Federal investigators found extensive evidence supporting Rajneesh's accusations, discovering the laboratory where salmonella had been cultivated, wiretapping equipment that had been used to bug rooms throughout the commune including Rajneesh's own quarters, and documents revealing plots including a plan to assassinate a U.S. attorney investigating the community. Ma Anand Sheila and several co-conspirators were eventually arrested in West Germany and extradited to the United States, where they faced charges including conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, first-degree assault, burglary, arson, and conspiracy to commit electronic eavesdropping. Sheila and two co-defendants entered guilty pleas in 1986 to charges including conspiracy to commit assault and conspiracy to commit electronic trespass, receiving sentences of 4.5 years in federal prison, considerably less than they might have received if convicted on all original charges at trial. Rajneesh himself was charged with immigration fraud for participating in sham marriages designed to allow his foreign followers to remain in the United States, and he entered a guilty plea in late 1985, receiving a suspended sentence and agreeing to leave the country, departing the United States and eventually returning to India, where he continued teaching until his death in 1990. The Rajneeshpuram community collapsed rapidly after these events, with most followers leaving the ranch, properties sold to satisfy debts and legal judgments, and the utopian city that had housed thousands reduced to empty buildings on a remote Oregon ranch. The question of justice in the Rajneesh case centers on why it took so long for authorities to investigate and prosecute clear criminal activity occurring at Rajneeshpuram, and why the sentences ultimately imposed seemed relatively light given the severity of the crimes committed. The salmonella attack was not recognized as deliberate bioterrorism for more than a year after it occurred, with health officials and law enforcement initially treating it as a natural outbreak or accidental contamination, a delay that meant no investigation into the perpetrators occurred until Rajneesh himself made accusations following Sheila's departure. The failure to identify the attack as deliberate reflected both the unprecedented nature of bioterrorism in the United States, which made investigators not think to consider it as a possibility, and the geographic and social distance between the Rajneesh community and the surrounding population, which meant investigators had no reason to suspect any connection between the outbreak and Rajneeshpuram. Even as tensions between Rajneeshpuram and local communities escalated through 1984 and 1985, law enforcement apparently did not consider the community a terrorism threat despite confrontational rhetoric and increasingly aggressive legal and political tactics. The immigration fraud that was occurring at the ranch, with sham marriages arranged to allow foreign followers to remain in the country, was apparently known to or suspected by immigration authorities for years before charges were filed, representing another delay in addressing illegal activity that was occurring openly at the community. The importation of homeless people from other cities as a voter manipulation scheme, while ultimately unsuccessful, represented an elaborate conspiracy to commit election fraud that authorities investigated, but which resulted in no criminal charges probably, because proving that homeless individuals had been specifically recruited to vote illegally rather than being legitimately moved to a location where they then registered to vote would be difficult. The plea bargains that resulted in Sheila and her co-conspirators serving only 4.5 years for conspiracy charges, when they could have faced much longer sentences for the full range of charges, including attempted murder related to specific plots against individual opponents, has been criticized as inadequate given the severity of the bioterrorism attack alone, which sickened more than 700 people and could have caused deaths if victims had been more vulnerable or if medical care had not been available. Rajneesh's deportation without prison time for immigration fraud. Despite evidence he had orchestrated the sham marriages and despite his role as leader of the community where numerous crimes occurred under his watch if not at his direction, frustrated some who believed he bore ultimate responsibility for the criminal activity at Rajneeshpuram and should have faced more serious consequences. The resolution of the case through plea bargains rather than trials meant that many questions about criminal activity at Rajneeshpuram were never fully answered in court, that the complete scope of conspiracies and crimes may never have been publicly established, and that some individuals who participated in criminal activity may never have been charged or identified. Victims of the salmonella poisoning received no compensation for their illness, their medical expenses, or the fear and disruption caused by the attack, with no mechanism available to provide restitution from defendants who were sentenced only to prison terms without financial penalties that would go to victims. The homeless people brought to Oregon as pawns in the voter fraud scheme were eventually abandoned by Rajneeshpuram when the plot fell apart, left without the housing and support they had been promised, victimized by an elaborate criminal conspiracy, but with no avenue for seeking justice or compensation for how they had been used. Local residents who had faced years of intimidation, legal harassment, and fear while living near Rajneeshpuram saw some vindication in the criminal charges and convictions, but many felt the sentences were too light and that justice had not been fully served given the sustained assault on their community that the Rajneesh followers had perpetrated. The systemic failure to investigate Rajneeshpuram aggressively despite numerous warning signs including the bioterrorism attack, the sham marriages, the election fraud plot, the importation of homeless people, and reports of weapons stockpiling and aggressive confrontations, reflects a broader pattern where authorities are hesitant to act against religious communities even when criminal activity is apparent. Perhaps from concerns about religious freedom, perhaps from uncertainty about how to address criminal behavior that is intertwined with spiritual practice, or perhaps from simple resource constraints and other priorities that led to delayed attention to a remote Oregon ranch even as major crimes were being planned and committed there. The relatively light sentences negotiated through plea bargains may reflect prosecutors' assessments that winning convictions at trial would be difficult given the complexity of the cases and the potential for defendants to argue they were following religious directives rather than acting with criminal intent, or may reflect practical concerns about the cost and resources required for lengthy trials against multiple defendants with substantial legal resources. Anand Sheila, released from prison after serving approximately 2.5 years of her 4.5-year sentence, moved to Switzerland where she manages care homes for the disabled and has given media interviews in which she expresses no remorse for her actions, maintains that she was protecting her community from persecution, and continues to defend Rajneesh as an enlightened master despite his accusations against her, demonstrating that legal justice through imprisonment did not result in acknowledgement of wrongdoing or reformation by the perpetrator of the bioterrorism attack. The legacy of Rajneeshpuram continues to shape Waco County, where residents remember the fear and disruption caused by the Rajneesh community, where property that was part of the commune remains visible though largely abandoned, and where the experience serves as a cautionary tale about the potential for religious movements to engage in criminal activity when they feel threatened and when charismatic leadership creates an environment where normal moral restraints are suspended in favor of defending the group and its mission. Number 9. Robert Tilton. Robert Tilton built one of the most successful and controversial televangelist ministries of the 1980s and early 1990s, broadcasting his success in life, program on hundreds of television stations, and generating estimated annual revenues of more than $80 million through solicitations promising that God would provide financial prosperity, physical healing, and personal success to those who sent donations to his ministry. Tilton's preaching centered on prosperity gospel theology, the doctrine that faith in God should result in material wealth and health, and that Christians who are not prosperous must have insufficient faith or must be failing to sow financial seeds through donations to ministries like his. His television broadcasts featured emotional preaching, testimonials from people who claimed to have received miraculous financial windfalls after sending donations, and appeals for viewers to send money along with prayer requests that Tilton promised he would personally pray over. The formula was extraordinarily effective at generating donations, with millions of dollars flowing into Tilton's ministry from viewers across the country who believed his promises that sending money would result in divine blessings that would multiply their giving many times over. Tilton lived lavishly on these donations, maintaining multiple luxury homes, expensive cars, and a lifestyle that contradicted his claims to be a humble servant of God, though he justified this wealth as evidence of God's blessing and as an example of the prosperity that donors could expect if they had sufficient faith. The scheme began to unravel in 1991 when ABC News program Primetime Live broadcast an investigation into Tilton's ministry, revealing that the prayer requests viewers sent along with their donations were not being prayed over as promised, but were instead being thrown away en masse after the donations had been processed and the checks deposited. Reporters found thousands of prayer requests and donation envelopes in trash dumpsters outside the facility that processed Tilton's mail, with the prayer requests unopened and discarded along with any enclosures like photographs or personal items that donors had sent asking for prayer, evidence that Tilton's promise to personally pray over these requests was fraudulent. The investigation also revealed that testimonials featured on Tilton's broadcasts about miraculous financial blessings and healings were often misleading or fabricated, with some supposed donors never having sent money to the ministry and others having written to report that they received no blessings despite sending donations, but having their letters edited to sound like positive testimonials. Former employees of the ministry described the operation as a business focused entirely on maximizing donations, with sophisticated marketing techniques, scripts for responding to donor calls designed to encourage additional giving, and no genuine religious mission beyond extracting money from vulnerable viewers. Following the Primetime Live broadcast, donations to Tilton's ministry dropped dramatically as viewers realized they had been deceived, and numerous stations canceled his program, reducing his broadcast reach considerably. Tilton filed a defamation lawsuit against ABC News, Disney, and individuals involved in the investigation, claiming the broadcast had damaged his reputation and destroyed his ministry, but the lawsuit was dismissed in 1993 with courts ruling that the investigation's revelations were true and therefore could not constitute defamation. Despite this legal defeat and the public exposure of his fraudulent practices, Tilton did not face criminal charges for fraud or for the deceptive solicitation of donations, and he eventually resumed televangelist activities on a smaller scale, continuing to solicit donations with prosperity gospel promises remarkably similar to those that had been exposed as fraudulent. The question of why Tilton faced no criminal prosecution despite clear evidence that he had deliberately deceived donors has multiple complex answers rooted in the legal treatment of religious solicitations and the practical challenges of prosecuting religious fraud. Proving criminal fraud requires demonstrating that the defendant made specific false statements, knew those statements were false, intended to deceive victims, and that victims relied on those false statements to their detriment in ways that constitute criminal conduct rather than simply disappointed expectations. In Tilton's case, while the evidence was clear that he was not praying over prayer requests as promised, prosecutors would need to prove that this broken promise constituted criminal fraud rather than simply failing to deliver on a spiritual commitment, a difficult distinction when courts have historically been reluctant to evaluate the sincerity of religious claims or the adequacy of religious services provided. The prosperity gospel promises that Tilton made about donors receiving financial blessings were phrased in terms of divine intervention rather than guarantees, making them difficult to prosecute as fraud because they involved predictions about future divine action that cannot be definitively proven false, even though the pattern of donors not receiving promised blessings suggested the promises were never realistic. The First Amendment protections for religious expression create additional obstacles to prosecuting religious fraud, with concerns that criminal charges over religious solicitations could be viewed as government interference with free exercise of religion, even when the solicitations are clearly deceptive and harmful. The IRS and state tax authorities could potentially pursue Tilton for tax issues if he was not properly reporting income, or if his ministry was not operating as a legitimate tax-exempt organization. But religious organizations receive substantial deference in tax matters, and proving that a ministry is fraudulent enough to lose tax exemption requires extensive investigation that tax authorities may not have resources or will to pursue. State attorneys general who oversee charitable solicitations could potentially pursue Tilton for deceptive fundraising practices, but these cases generally result in civil penalties and injunctive relief rather than criminal charges, and many states have minimal enforcement of charitable solicitation laws, especially regarding religious organizations. Victims of Tilton's fraud were individually defrauded of relatively modest amounts in most cases, perhaps $20 or $50 or $100 per donation, and while these amounts accumulated to enormous sums for Tilton, the small individual losses meant that victims were unlikely to pursue individual legal action even if they realized they had been deceived. The embarrassment factor was significant, as many people who had donated to Tilton did not want to publicly acknowledge they had been deceived by a televangelist, particularly in religious communities where admitting to being defrauded might be seen as admitting to lack of faith or poor judgment. Class action lawsuits were filed against Tilton by donors seeking to recover their donations, but these cases faced challenges including difficulty certifying a class of victims, statute of limitations issues, and Tilton's claims that financial difficulties resulting from the scandal had left him unable to pay large judgments. And the lawsuits generally resulted in modest settlements or dismissals rather than substantial recovery for victims. Tilton declared bankruptcy in 1993, claiming he was unable to pay his debts following the collapse of his ministry, a legal maneuver that allowed him to discharge many obligations without fully compensating creditors or donors, though questions persisted about whether he had actually lost his wealth or had simply transferred assets in ways that protected them from creditors while claiming poverty. The bankruptcy proceeding itself was controversial, with trustees questioning Tilton's disclosures about assets and investigating whether he had concealed wealth or engaged in fraudulent transfers. But ultimately, the bankruptcy was concluded without criminal charges emerging from any financial irregularities discovered during the process. The ability of someone like Tilton to defraud donors of millions of dollars, to be publicly exposed as operating a fraudulent ministry, and then to avoid any criminal prosecution while eventually resuming similar activities demonstrates significant gaps in consumer protection when fraud is cloaked in religious language and structured as religious donations. The donors who lost money to Tilton's false promises, who sent donations they could not afford based on his assurances that God would multiply their giving, who prayed over envelopes containing their rent money or medical bill payments believing Tilton would pray for them in return, received no restitution and no real accountability from the person who defrauded them. Some of these donors were elderly people on fixed incomes who sent money hoping for healing or financial help with their limited resources, making Tilton's exploitation particularly predatory and the lack of criminal consequences particularly troubling. The continuation of prosperity gospel preaching by numerous other televangelists making similar promises to those Tilton made, with similar evidence of donations being used to fund lavish lifestyles rather than charitable work, suggests that Tilton's exposure and the lack of criminal consequences had minimal deterrent effect on religious fraud more broadly. Regulatory changes that might have prevented similar fraud, such as requiring religious organizations to disclose financial information or to demonstrate that donations are used as promised in solicitations, have not been implemented partly because religious organizations lobby against such requirements as burdensome interference with religious freedom. The legal system's treatment of Tilton's case established or reinforced a precedent that religious fundraising based on promises of divine blessing is not subject to the same fraud prosecution that would apply to similar promises in secular commercial contexts, creating a practical immunity for prosperity gospel ministers who can continue to solicit donations based on promises that are never fulfilled without facing criminal consequences as long as they frame their promises in religious and spiritual language. The decades that Tilton operated his fraudulent ministry before exposure, the millions of dollars he extracted from victims, the lack of any criminal prosecution despite clear evidence of deception, and his ability to eventually resume similar activities all demonstrate a systemic failure to protect vulnerable consumers from religious fraud that parallels the failure seen in other cases of religious leaders who faced delayed or absent justice for their exploitation of followers' faith and trust. Number 10. Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker rose to prominence in the 1970s and 1980s as the host of the PTL Club television program, building a massive religious broadcasting empire alongside his wife Tammy Faye that reached millions of viewers daily and generated enormous revenue through donations and the sale of religious merchandise. PTL stood officially for Praise the Lord, or People That Love, and the show featured a talk show format with Christian music, celebrity guests, and constant appeals for donations to support the ministry and its various projects. Bakker's most ambitious project was Heritage USA, a Christian-themed park and resort near Fort Mill, South Carolina, envisioned as a destination where Christian families could vacation in an environment aligned with their values, featuring hotels, a water park, shopping, amphitheaters, and recreational facilities spread across more than 2,000 acres. To finance Heritage USA's construction and expansion, Bakker initiated a fundraising program called Lifetime Partnerships, where donors who contributed $1,000 or more would receive annual 3-night stays at Heritage USA hotels for the rest of their lives. A promise that generated tens of millions of dollars in donations as thousands of people purchased these partnerships believing they were making both a donation to Christian ministry and an investment in future vacation accommodations. The scheme was fundamentally fraudulent because Bakker sold far more lifetime partnerships than the Heritage USA hotels could accommodate, ultimately selling more than 150,000 partnerships for a hotel that could only house about 500 families at a time, making it mathematically impossible to honor the commitments made to donors even if every donor only used their partnership once per year. Bakker and PTL executives knew the partnerships could not all be honored but continued selling them anyway, using the donations to fund lavish spending including Bakker's personal lifestyle expenses, Tammy Faye's shopping and extravagant wardrobe, expensive cars, luxury accommodations, and various other expenditures that had little connection to religious ministry or the Heritage USA project donors believed they were supporting. In 1987, the PTL scandal exploded into public view with multiple revelations that would destroy Bakker's ministry and send him to prison, beginning with disclosure that Bakker had engaged in a sexual encounter with church secretary Jessica Hahn in 1980 and that PTL had paid her $265,000 in ministry funds to keep silent about the encounter. The scandal widened as investigative journalists and prosecutors examined PTL's finances, discovering the lifetime partnership fraud, the personal enrichment of the Bakkers, and evidence that ministry funds had been diverted to pay off other potential scandal witnesses and to maintain the Bakkers' lifestyle. Jim Bakker resigned from PTL in March 1987 as the sexual and financial scandals became public, and Jerry Falwell temporarily took over PTL's leadership, promising to restore integrity to the ministry. But the financial situation was dire, with PTL facing more than $70 million in debts and with donor confidence shattered by the revelations of fraud and misconduct. Heritage USA filed for bankruptcy. Investigations by federal prosecutors and the IRS intensified, and in 1988 Jim Bakker was indicted on federal charges of fraud and conspiracy for his role in the lifetime partnership scheme. At trial in 1989, prosecutors presented evidence that Bakker had oversold the partnerships, knowing they could not be honored, that he had diverted ministry funds for personal use, and that he had engaged in systematic fraud over years while portraying himself as a man of God deserving of his followers' financial support and trust. Bakker was convicted on 24 counts of fraud and conspiracy, and Judge Robert Potter sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $500,000 in fines, a sentence that reflected the judge's view that Bakker had engaged in extensive fraud, victimizing thousands of people who trusted him because of his religious position. The sentence was controversial and criticized as excessive, and on appeal was reduced first to 8 years and eventually to approximately 5 years, which Bakker served before being released from prison in 1994, having served time in federal medical facilities where he was treated for psychological issues including anxiety and panic attacks related to his conviction and imprisonment. During his imprisonment, Bakker reportedly experienced a religious transformation, claiming he had been wrong to preach prosperity gospel and that he had misled people through his ministry's focus on material success rather than spiritual development, a conversion narrative that he would later use as he attempted to rebuild a public ministry. After his release, Bakker initially maintained a lower profile but eventually returned to television ministry in the early 2000s, hosting The Jim Bakker Show, which aired on Christian television networks and featured a format similar to his earlier PTL show with talk segments, guests, and fundraising appeals. This time, Bakker's pitch focused on selling survival gear, food supplies, and products related to preparing for the end times, pivoting from prosperity gospel to apocalyptic fears, but maintaining the fundamental model of using religious content to sell products and solicit donations. His show featured constant promotion of expensive survival food buckets that he claimed would be necessary when societal collapse arrived, of generators and water filtration systems for surviving disasters, and of books and videos about biblical prophecy and the end times, all sold at prices critics argued were inflated far above the actual value of the products. Bakker's survival food offerings became particularly controversial, with investigations finding that the calorie counts and serving sizes advertised were misleading, that the nutritional value of the food was inadequate for actual survival situations, and that the prices were dramatically higher than similar products available from other suppliers. All while Bakker used fearmongering about potential disasters to pressure viewers into purchasing products they probably did not need and could not afford. In 2020, Bakker faced legal action from Missouri Attorney General for false claims he had made on his show about a colloidal silver product he was promoting as a treatment or cure for COVID-19, statements that had no scientific basis and that violated laws against making unproven health claims about products sold to consumers. The case resulted in a settlement where Bakker agreed to stop making false claims about products sold on his show and to pay restitution, though he admitted no wrongdoing and continued broadcasting his program with minimal interruption. Throughout his post-prison ministry career, Bakker continued to solicit donations and sell products using techniques similar to those that had led to his fraud conviction, raising questions about why someone with a federal fraud conviction was able to return to religious fundraising and why authorities did not take stronger action to prevent continued consumer harm. The answer lies partly in the completion of Bakker's sentence, which meant he had paid his legal debt and could no longer be punished for his previous crimes, and partly in the continued regulatory gaps around religious fundraising and the sale of products promoted on religious television programs. The First Amendment protections that make prosecuting religious fraud difficult also make it difficult to prevent convicted fraudsters from returning to religious broadcasting once they have completed their sentences, since preventing someone from engaging in religious speech or ministry based on past convictions would raise serious constitutional concerns about prior restraint and religious freedom. The Federal Trade Commission has authority over false advertising and deceptive business practices, but enforcement actions are resource-intensive and typically result in civil penalties and consent orders rather than criminal charges, and religious programs may receive less scrutiny than secular commercial advertising despite using similar sales techniques and making similar potentially deceptive claims. The consumers who purchased Bakker's lifetime partnerships in the 1980s lost their investments and in most cases received no compensation even after his conviction, since PTL's bankruptcy meant there were insufficient assets to make lifetime partnership holders whole, and since restitution orders in criminal cases are often uncollectible when defendants lack sufficient assets to pay. The betrayal these donors experienced was profound, having given money to what they believed was Christian ministry and having received promises about lifetime benefits in return, only to discover that their trust had been exploited and their donations had funded luxury spending rather than the projects they were told about. Many of these donors were elderly people or families of modest means who had saved to purchase lifetime partnerships, viewing them as both charitable giving and as an investment in future family vacations, making the financial loss particularly painful and the breach of trust particularly damaging. Former PTL employees and partners who had dedicated years to the ministry and who lost their livelihoods when PTL collapsed received little attention in the legal proceedings that focused on donor fraud rather than on the harm to people whose careers and lives had been built around an organization that turned out to be fundamentally corrupt. Tammy Faye Backer divorced Jim in 1992 while he was in prison and later married Roe Messner, the contractor who had built Heritage USA, and she spent her remaining years attempting to rehabilitate her image and to some degree succeeded in gaining public sympathy as someone who had been a somewhat naive participant in her husband's schemes rather than a willing co-conspirator. Though her lavish spending and her role in PTL's fundraising appeals certainly contributed to the fraud even if she was not criminally charged. The question of justice in the Backer case is complicated by the fact that he did serve prison time for his fraud, unlike many of the other religious leaders discussed here, who never faced criminal charges at all, yet the sentence he served was reduced from the initial 45 years to approximately 5 years, time that many victims felt was inadequate given the scope of his fraud and the number of people he harmed. His return to religious broadcasting and his apparent continuation of questionable fundraising practices, though perhaps not rising to the level of criminal fraud, demonstrated that his conviction had not reformed his basic approach to religious ministry as a vehicle for personal enrichment through exploitation of people's faith and fears. The regulatory and legal systems that allowed Backer to return to practices similar to those that led to his conviction, that continue to permit prosperity gospel preachers and apocalyptic marketers to make claims that would be prosecuted as fraud in secular contexts, and that provide minimal protection for consumers of religious products and services, represent ongoing failures to address the structural problems that enabled Backer's original fraud and that continue to leave vulnerable people at risk of exploitation by charismatic religious figures making promises they cannot or will not keep.